Okay, for our next talk, we have Edmund Schuster, who's giving a talk called Cloud Crypto Land.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Wasim for having me. So I'm primarily a corporate and securities lawyer, and I came to this broader topic during the kind of ICO craze. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that, and I'm sure everyone in the room has a kind of a favorite silly ICO that you witnessed. Initially, when witnessing this space, I kind of started doubting the sanity of humankind. As a somewhat cynical securities lawyer, there's an alternative theory explaining what's going on. I call it idiocy by design. Imagine you want to launder money through an ICO. The last thing you need is actual investors giving you money, because they might actually get upset if you never build anything. And so I think some of the most ridiculous ICOs might actually be designed to not be attractive for any outside investors because it helps you with money laundering. In any event, the whole crypto craze swapped over into kind of mainstream business, and lawyers got really excited about it all. And over in the UK, our politicians also got excited about it. So blockchain was a kind of do-it-all solution for everything. You may not be very familiar with that. We had a big Brexit discussion in the UK, and one of the problems was that there's problems on the Irish border, and so our basically finance minister decided that, you know, probably blockchain could solve that, and we don't need physical border infrastructure because blockchain, right? So I started looking into that, and what I'm interested in is the promise of this technology to replace some of the systems that we currently use in our broader financial and economic system. And I'll explain. I have a fairly narrow focus on kind of non-currency applications, and I just want to give you an idea of how a lawyer could look at the technology. Obviously, you don't need a lawyer to explain blockchain technology to you. I just want to explain to you how we kind of conceptualize this technology. And then, and I know this may be a hard sell in this room, I will argue that there are legal reasons for why this technology cannot be used meaningfully to trade in, transfer, and kind of tokenize real-world assets. And I'll also talk a bit about smart contracts and why they don't really change or are unlikely to change the world. Okay, so my starting point is to just look at the normal physical world, and we say, how do we transfer assets that have a physical existence? And you could say, well, we don't really have to worry about things like the double spending problem, because prohibition of double spending is enforced by the laws of physics. If I have an apple and I give it to you, then obviously I can't give it to anyone else again. And that is really what enables peer-to-peer transfer. We don't need to go through any centralized party. We just hand over an asset. And legal systems around the world have basically jumped on this feature and said, well, if peer-to-peer transfers work because of possession enforcing certain aspects of the transfer we want, then let's just piggyback on possession, and all legal systems around the world give a very special status to the fact that I have an apple in my hand. So they protect the trust in people that this is probably my apple. So there are special legal rules designed around that. Now, there are other types of assets. These are assets that are not tangible assets, like IP rights or something like that. Or there are assets where the correlation between what you could call physical control or possession over the asset and legal ownership is very weak traditionally. So this would be true for real estate, for instance, right? The fact that I'm in this lecture hall does not make it more probable that I'm the legal owner. Now, for these types of assets, so intangibles and assets where the correlation between possession and legal ownership is very weak, we have other types of mechanisms that the legal system devised over centuries for how to deal with them. Now, if you look at digital assets, that is always true for those digital assets, right? Because no digital representation of anything can be unique, and that is, of course, a good thing. Now, what are the solutions we have? We can do peer-to-peer transfers in those assets, and we've been doing that, again, for centuries. For instance, when it comes to contractual rights. We just say, if somebody owes money to me, I can assign my right to receive this money to anyone else in a purely peer-to-peer fashion. However, because this is not backed up by any sort of possession, well, what we end up with is we need trust. So when I assign my right to you, you just need to trust me that I actually have a right to assign. There's no protection of this trust. And the alternative is obviously that we have some sort of a central ledger, some register of rights. And we do that in many countries for real estate, for instance, sometimes for IP rights, where we just say we have a central database that records those rights. And if we transfer, it cannot happen in a purely peer-to-peer fashion. We go through the central register, and that allows us to transfer those rights. So, as a lawyer looking at blockchain technology, you could say, well, blockchain technology kind of gives us an additional way of doing that. We don't need the central register, and we can also do away with the trust. So if you look at blockchain technology through the eyes of a lawyer, you could say it's a bit like somebody inventing a very good cash fax machine. If you have a fax machine that always ensures that the banknote that you fax to somebody is actually destroyed and cannot be copied on the other end, then it would be very easy to convince lawyers and politicians that it's a very good idea to treat faxed banknotes as actual banknotes, right? Because now there's no risk of duplication of those banknotes, and it's much more efficient than always having to hand over cash, right? Obviously, you can't build something like that, but blockchain technology kind of conceptually is similar to that. So in that sense, blockchain technology can be seen as kind of replicating the features of the physical world from the perspective of transfers of legal rights. It's not quite the same. You don't need central registers, but you need some sort of online interaction, whatever your design. Now, if you look historically at blockchain technology from that perspective, you can say, well, that's not really new. We've had that before. The exact history is somewhat obscure, but generally speaking, the consensus is that merchants in medieval times came up with a system where they just started using pieces of paper and pretended that those pieces of paper stand in and represent legal rights, so other intangibles. And a whole kind of body of law has developed around that over the centuries, called the law merchant or lex mercatoria. And the whole system was based on merchants agreeing among themselves, initially without any help from government, without any help from the legal system as such. They just agreed to have funny little pieces of paper, and they said, wouldn't it be useful to use the legal rules we have for transferring physical assets for these legal rights? So we just say, a claim, a contractual claim, a claim to receive money. We will now represent that by this piece of paper. And now we have the advantage of using our normal legal rules for transferring physical assets among ourselves, and we can actually transfer those contractual rights. Right? So that is what happens, and in a sense you could say that's kind of an early version of Cody's law. If you look at the very early history of that area, what happened was that judges looked at this and said, well, you're a bit silly here because you treat the piece of paper as if it was the claim, but we all know that in order to transfer a contractual claim, certain conditions must be fulfilled, and you'd never check that. You just treat the fact that somebody hands over the piece of paper as conclusive proof that the claim has passed without asking any questions, right? And so initially, the reaction of the legal system very early on was that just doesn't work. This is not how you transfer legal rights. This is how you transfer an apple. It's not how you transfer legal rights. After some initial hesitation, judges have come to the conclusion that actually it's very useful what they do. So let them play their game. Let them treat the pieces of paper as conclusive proof for having this right because it's so useful. It kind of removes a lot of the problems that you have in international trade and finance. And so the legal system has carved out certain types of transactions from the normal legal rules and has said, if merchants decide to treat those pieces of paper as conclusive proof, we will just give them that. And so, in a sense, the legal system endorsed this way of doing it. So, when I look at this space, I kind of distinguish what I call naked or native applications for blockchains. These are cryptocurrencies, but they're also, that would also include, for instance, decentralized storage or CryptoKitties. So anything where a transaction that happens within the system already fully fulfills whatever you want to transfer. So there's nothing that happens outside of your protocol. Everything is kind of embedded and, in the system. Now, nothing interesting to say about these. But for everything else, we have something happening in your system and then an expectation that something else will happen in the real world. So that would be true for securities tokens and for putting really any asset on the blockchain. Because even for securities token, if you say this is a security and we will trade those securities in that particular way, the question ultimately will be, if the company does make a profit and you want to receive a dividend or something, ultimately the question is who will get this dividend, and so that has to happen in the real world. So there must be a connection between what happens in your system and the legal world. So my simple argument is, for all these assets, so whenever you expect something to happen in the real world, then you, in a way, have to rely on the legal system to support your enforcement of these rights. So that is unavoidable. The second thing that is unavoidable is that the law places strict limits on what people can agree on. So under certain circumstances, no matter what you agree to in advance, certain transactions will not be recognized by any legal system. If I come to your house with a gun and you transfer something to me, no legal system will ever give effect to it. The same is true for the case I mentioned before. So the law merchant was endorsed by the legal system, but subject to exceptions. So what judges have developed is you can play your game as long as you want. However, if it turns out that somebody fraudulently came into possession of this piece of paper, or put a gun to your head or something like that, then we will not enforce the right. So we will not treat you as the rightful owner of whatever claim you have. Now, I hope everyone in the room agrees that there's just no possible way of encoding within your protocol the entire complexity of all legal rules. That is just impossible. It's impossible for various reasons. One reason is that the legal rules are not rigid and certain, and the second is that it depends on the interpretation of what happens in the real world. So I'm happy to discuss that, but I hope everyone agrees with that. Now, if you agree with these three steps, then the problem is one that you could describe as a problem of synchronization. So you now have a system that allows you to transfer legal rights. However, the legal system does not allow certain types of transfers that may be consistent with the rules of your protocol, but that are incompatible with the legal system. So you need some way in which you resynchronize those two systems. So you could imagine, conceptually, the legal system as one big ledger that records what's the actual allocation of legal rights to individuals in the world, and your blockchain system, or any other ledger for that matter, to be a different ledger that may deviate in its content from the legal ledger. And so we have a synchronization problem. We just need to make sure that the two are in alignment. If you don't do that, then you will have a slow drifting apart of those two ledgers, right? After some time, some transactions will happen within your protocol, but are incompatible with the legal system. And if that happens, then this drifting apart will erode the trust in the veracity of the record within your system for all assets, because there's no way for you to audit consistency with the legal rules all the way back, right? So you need to realign, because otherwise nobody wants to use those assets, given that challenges can happen further up the chain. So what can we do about that? We can fix that easily. We just give the state, so judge or something like that, a super key, write permission, and so that is what I suggest we should all do. Then we're all good, right? Obviously, that's pointless. If we do that, we just recreate a centralized database, but in the most inefficient and ridiculous way, right? We do all the decentralization, and then we re-centralize at the end, so all the overhead is good for absolutely nothing. Even if we somehow manage to improve the efficiency of those systems dramatically, such that there's no efficiency advantage over a decentralized system. So centralized systems are exactly as efficient as decentralized systems. Even then, we haven't really managed to do anything, right? There's no new functionality. So I compare that with the proposal to write all contracts in red ink, right? Yeah, sure, you can do that. And red ink is just more expensive. You can tell me that there are ways to make red ink as cheap as black ink, sure, right? But it doesn't change anything. Okay, so let's not do that. That's probably not a good idea. We could say maybe we just need an anchor jurisdiction, some crypto-friendly place that says more or less code is law, and then we just all choose that law for our system. So we agree in advance to be bound by the law of Liechtenstein or something like that, and then we're all good. The problem is that also doesn't work because choice of law rules in every jurisdiction have exceptions. They say, generally, yes, you can choose whatever law you want for your contract. However, if the legal system that you choose allows transactions that are against public policy in our jurisdiction, we will not give effect to that choice of law. So that is an ordre public exception in all choice of law clauses everywhere in the world, and doesn't really help us. We could use oracles. The problem with oracles is, because we are here dealing with a synchronization problem, in order for the oracles to actually help us, the oracles would have to replicate what the judge says, right? So you have, in a sense, an oracle that is a glorified court reporter. And if that's the case, then it's useless, because we are back at one. And if they say something different, then you don't solve the problem, right? So it doesn't really help us. Now, you could have some adjudication or governance on the blockchain, but you have the same problem here. They can agree, they can say the same thing as the judge, in which case you're back at A, or they don't solve the problem. So you have kind of a possible trade-off here. So you can have a pointless system that re-centralizes, just, yeah, that works, but that is contracts in red ink. Or you can have a system where you don't ensure synchronization, in which case you have a system that is very likely to be useless in the long term. So you have this pointless, useless trade-off here, I would argue. Now, that only applies, of course, to the current state of the world. It could be the case, you could say, well, we can fix that, right? We just convince legal systems to endorse blockchain technology, and similar to what I described in relation to the Lex Mercatoria, they just say this is such a useful piece of technology or type of technology that we will do away with the rules that I just described, and then it might work. The problem is the endorsement by the legal system needs to be absolute or near absolute, and there's just no indication that anyone is willing to do that at the moment. So I've looked at many, announcements for crypto-friendly laws, and they all have carve-outs for the obvious problems that can arise in those systems. Ultimately, this is a question of how useful that is, right? It's a cost-benefit trade-off. It's very easy to explain why in medieval times, when you trade stuff between Italy and London or something like that, it's really useful to have those pieces of paper that you can present to your merchant banker in Naples or something like that. So the question is, how much benefit can we expect from any of that? Reading some of the kind of tech-focused literature, you get the impression that people believe that lawyers sit around and sue each other for crystal clear obligations. That is just not the case, right? There's no JP Morgan versus Goldman case where the price has reached a certain barrier limit and Goldman just doesn't pay, right? That is not the case. That is not the type of problem that we run into. And so the problem is, you can't typically code all of an agreement in a satisfactory form. And if you can, I would argue it's very unlikely to be a very important or useful agreement. Perhaps more importantly, we already do use those algorithmic agreements wherever it is useful. When I use the underground system in London, I just tap my card. There's a whole lot of things happening in the background, and one way to look at it is that somebody looked at the agreement that I have with the transport operator and said, this is a terribly complicated relationship because all sorts of things can go wrong. I can be slapped by, one of the staff or something like that. All of that is going on there, but 99.999% of the interactions are dead simple. So what should we do? The solution is obvious. You just code the simple stuff, and you get to 99.999%. And then the utility of automation decreases so rapidly that no sane person would continue on from that point. It's just not worth doing. So we already do that without smart contracts, and we have the same for mortgage payments or something like that. In most cases, there's no actual interaction with people. So from that perspective, if you look at some of the perceived benefits of smart contracts, it seems to me that people underestimate why we use the legal language that we actually use. And so in a sense, you have a trade-off between the kind of predictability and rigidity of a language and its usefulness. And so why do we use the language we use in contracts? Probably because over centuries we found a sweet spot that is more rigid, more predictable, easier to interpret than natural, normal language, but that is much more flexible than anything that you could code in a kind of mathematical, very rigid language. So the problem is not that lawyers are too stupid to use precise language and we need coders to bring that into the legal sphere. The actual truth, I would argue, is it's not very useful to use this rigid language. And I've worked on transactions where for aspects of it, it is useful to use mathematical language. And what we do is we say in the contract is to be determined in accordance with the following equation. Or we say is to be calculated in accordance with the Excel sheet attached to this agreement, as typically on a CD, probably. Okay, so what the hype in the kind of business and legal world is what I describe as the kind of McKinsey fallacy. You come to a system that has grown over years, decades, centuries, and you say, well, that's silly. Wouldn't it be much better to do it this way, right? And that is, of course, true, right? If you can get everyone to use a new system, it's vastly better. If you switch the entire global financial systems to run on Game Boys, it would be more efficient. It would certainly be more efficient. But nobody in their right mind should say, therefore, let's switch to Game Boys, right? The solution, or the argument is, any system that you can build from the ground up will be better. The problem is nobody knows how to do that because you need to convince everyone there are enormous costs for switching. And so, in a sense, it's the lazy thing to say, here is how much more efficient it could be to use a blockchain system. Of course, but that is not because it's a blockchain system. It's because you assume that cost of change is zero, that you can make this transition happen despite centuries and centuries of habit and a grown ecosystem and so on. And so then using the current system as a comparator is just wrong, right? Yeah, it's more efficient than what you have now, but in order to make a meaningful argument, you have to say, if we can build this system from ground up using, let's say, blockchain technology, it's more efficient than any other technology that you could use, provided that everyone switches to what I want them to switch to at the snap of a finger. So, having said that, I think blockchain technology can still drive useful change because, having discussed this with many people who are not very keen on technology generally, my impression, very strong impression, is that suddenly, back office technology has become something that you can talk to with C-level executives, right? People, if 20 years ago you go somewhere and say, shouldn't we migrate our system to the new whatever, they would say, oh, you IT idiots could figure that out. I have important things to do. Nowadays, this has entered the discussion, and then we are kind of back to the Game Boy argument. It doesn't really matter what I say about blockchain technology if the hype around it enables and makes more likely a wholesale change in the way we do things, then this will already be of tremendous value. So I kind of say, if you have a permissionless, decentralized system that's pretty much useless for anything, that is non-native to the protocol. In the paper, I also talk about kind of these enterprise use cases, which I don't find particularly inspiring, and I kind of discuss what the smart contract reality is compared to what we can already do with existing technology. And I hope I provide some arguments why it's unlikely that the law will adapt to the full extent necessary to kind of invalidate my argument. Thank you.
Yeah, so actually I have one question to start. So I think you said that this argument doesn't apply to assets that are native, so monetary assets, domain names, that kind of thing. Is your position that blockchains can be useful for those, and it's just it's just representing real-world assets on chain that is impossible, or is it that those applications are also just sort of useless and it's not worth discussing them?
My point in relation to kind of monetary assets is that it can be useful as long as we have transactions that fully happen within the system. I personally think it's fairly unlikely for that to happen because ultimately you need an interface to the real world. So I think it's useful in the sense that if you have a blockchain asset, Bitcoin or whatever, and people consistently and reliably assign value to it, it can be useful for the interactions within the system, but it does not actually offer advantages, for instance, in the smart contract field, because if I have a smart contract that is connected to Bitcoin but also has an interface to the real world, then all the problems are reintroduced.
Okay, so you've given us a very critical and pessimistic view of the scope and possibilities of these technologies, so I thought I'll play devil's advocate and try to propose something a bit more optimistic, see if we can meet in the middle. So perhaps blockchains, if not as a kind of optimal technical architecture innovation, they could be useful as a social coordination technology, you know, the tribe of blockchain, or however you want to describe it. So I like the analogy of shipping containers. And shipping containers just kind of standardize the way that things moved around the world. It may not be the optimum size, shape, or mechanism, but it provided some kind of coordination point, focal point, Schelling point. Do you think that that is possible, even if we live in this incompatible impossibility, that, as you describe it?
Absolutely. So that is actually a version of my kind of positive blockchain can drive useful change. It doesn't matter if it's more efficient, if you somehow manage to reap the benefits of standardization. Standardization is so powerful an efficiency driver that the underlying standard just isn't that important if you start from an inefficient point, and that's probably where we are at the moment.
Okay, I wonder if you can compare your legal point to the way that the legal system has approached cryptography in general. So kind of at first, I think, as I understand in the 70s, when cryptography was first invented, it was a military tech and kind of banned for export, and so the US required, for example, kind of weaker cryptography to be used in foreign countries and so on. You couldn't, and then there was cryptography was kind of illegal in some way, and then it was kind of made clear that actually, when you make strong cryptography illegal and people use weak cryptography, that actually weakens the whole infrastructure of everything you use. And so the system basically allowed for cryptography as a new kind of innovation, as a new thing that you could do. You can write secret messages that the government can't read now. And that's kind of, and now we all use Signal or whatever. So I wonder if it's conceivable that this is a similar kind of new thing that we haven't seen before, this kind of transactions that you can't stop, kind of similar to messages that might have some parallel result.
Yeah, so my problem with this argument is that with cryptography, there is no alternative, right? So cryptography, you can prohibit it. It's actually not very efficient to prohibit it because you can't stop people from actually using it. You can just stop the marketing. And there is no alternative that is somehow better for the state, right? It's not like we have 10 different choices of making messages secure, and we're now talking about the specific algorithm. So in order for that argument to apply, you're back at the benefit-cost analysis, and you have to show that unless you make this the legal standard or endorsed by the legal system, you have a problem. And if the only thing that you can show is this, unless you do that, you need a centralized register that is controlled by the state, I doubt that this will convince lawmakers.
Thank you. That was really fun, as evidenced by all the questions. 2 quick points and 2 trivial questions. I'd say that centralized is really efficient, so it's not completely pointless. It has some value. Just putting a cryptographic fingerprint on a database has some value. Is there a notion, you do European law, is there a notion there of meeting of the minds? In the US, if you have on a contract and we litigate, and the judge decides that you guys did not use the same language and didn't know it, they can annul the contract. And I was wondering if that concept of no meeting of the minds to retroactively destroy the contract has any value here, because you can imagine like people would say, we don't really know what's going on in that smart contract. And the side question is, what do you mean by smart contract? Anything written in Solidity, the broad one, or the very narrow one, or perhaps anything that uses information from the database known as the distributed ledger, very broad one. So what do you mean by it, and is there a meeting of the minds problem? Thank you.
So for the meeting of mind problem, yes, absolutely. So that is an additional problem for it, right? Because if you have an agreement with a bug in it, it's fairly easy to show to the judge, well, we did not intend for this to take effect, right? And then it needs to be rolled back. But that just reintroduces, all, I think, all of the problems. Sorry.
What did you mean by smart contract? Is it narrow, anything written in Solidity, or is it broad, any piece of code working on data that comes from a distributed ledger, which is a database.
So I think for the purposes of the argument, the question is, do you have an agreement that is supposed to run or supposed to change its state according to some input, and where the parties intend for these state changes to define their legal rights?
Okay, so the broad one, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I love this kind of vision that what we've got on the chain is kind of moving apart from the real world. What I was wondering is whether if things are okay, 99.99% of the time, this may be what you meant by this kind of master secret key that the government holds, but could we imagine kind of adding on to our technology some additional technology that is flagging the things that are under some legal dispute, and then actually working on that technological problem of how, as legal things are resolved in the real world, we do reflect that back onto the chain? I wasn't sure if that was what you meant by your master key.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that you can actually usefully conceptualize this as a purely technical problem. In a way, so kind of, if you think about this slogan, rule of law implies a hierarchy, right? And the idea of the legal system is more important than everything else. So yes, you can design technical solutions that lead to the same result. But if they work, then all you've done is you replace the kind of uncomfortable notion of them having the secret key with some system that has the exact same effect, right? And so I'm not sure how much further that actually brings us, right? It's like I will be in perfect compliance with the law without you having to put me to prison. Just means that if a new law is passed, the judge says whatever, this is a terrorist, or this country you can't do business with, we need to roll it back. And if we don't roll it back, you are back at the problem. That's kind of, so I'm not sure that it's a technical problem.
One last quick question.
Oh, it's not quick. So there are 40 companies in Canada that have crypto and are publicly traded. And CPAB, the head of the accounting board, said in the 8 audits they tested, 7 failed because they failed to realize that not your keys, not your Bitcoin is just something crazy Bitcoiners say, and that really you need to assess your legal rights and your control rights in every audit. You can't just say like, oh, you have the Bitcoin key, that's your Bitcoin. No, you need to provide receipts. And so we're at the rubber hits the road when we're auditing. We're like, just like, show me the receipts for your Bitcoin. I don't care about your private key only. I need all the legal background that comes with this. And we are building tools to help with that process using like cipher trace or chain analysis to start tagging and flagging bad transactions. So like we can do something like not as extreme as a key that rolls back in my mind, but if you just say this is tainted money, it can only go back to this address until the government will accept it, right? And then every government can just be like, oh yeah, taint, 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 and then you don't roll it back, you just say this is worthless until it goes back here.
Absolutely. And so this is what you can do with the native tokens, right? You just have to say, I will, in effect what you describe is controlling the interface with the real world. I can't stop you from transferring the Bitcoins to other addresses. What I can say is that everyone under my jurisdiction will be prevented from using the traditional financial system and providing you with an interface. That's what blacklisting really means. The exchange will not give you cash for it.
It's like when banks explode blue money on their blueness of them, the bank money, cash.
But so that doesn't work for other assets, right? Because for other assets, it's not, as long as the Bitcoin is in some address, right? It doesn't really concern the legal system directly. For contractual rights, you can't do it without rolling back, because if you put a gun to my head to transfer security to you, then I will go to the judge and say, this company owes me the dividend, not you, right? And so the effect is not about rolling back the Bitcoin transaction. The effect is that I can ensure that the real world result is according to the legal system.
Great. Thanks very much, Edmund.